ask you some personal questions. And I want you to take a moment to think about your answers, using a scale of never, rarely, sometimes, always, okay? Never, rarely, sometimes, always. You ready? How often do you find it hard to feel close to people? How often do you feel left out? How often do you feel that no one really knows you well? How often do you feel isolated from others? How often do you find that there's just no one there to talk to? If you answered sometimes or always to these questions, you may be more likely to be lonely, like me. I am alone. I'm not alone in that loneliness. In a widely publicized study presented by Stigma Health in 2018, 61% of those surveyed reported feeling very lonely. I took the survey based on UCLA's loneliness scale with questions similar to those that you just answered. And sure enough, I suffer from loneliness. The loneliness problem is a pervasive one, so much so that scientists have been working to identify causes and ways to prevent it. As a communications scholar, I was curious about the impact that this would have on our behaviors. But as a person, I wanted to better understand my own experience to ward off some of the adverse effects. We have a serious problem here, but I believe we can do something about it. When we consider the implications, the New York Times attests that as we age, loneliness can impair our health by raising stress hormones. It's just not healthy to be in fight or flight all the time. This, in turn, increases inflammation. Inflammation that leads to cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, arthritis, and dementia. As if that weren't enough, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention report that social isolation significantly increases a person's risk of premature death, a risk that may rival those of smoking, physical inactivity, and obesity. Right now, we are living through an unprecedented pandemic, and we are forcibly isolated. The CDC identified many common reactions to the pandemic that could complicate our mental health, such as feelings of guilt, fear, uncertainty, and loneliness. In April 2020, the National Center for Health Statistics launched a survey in partnership with the United States Census Bureau to try to determine the impact that this could have on our overall health. From the period of April to June, the weekly survey found that Americans across nearly all age groups reported a steady increase in depression symptoms. Now, please don't confuse loneliness with depression. Depression for many is a very real and serious condition and requires medical treatment. This is still a cause for concern because loneliness isn't just a temporary experience. All too often, it creates a cycle of isolation. Right now, we are living through an unprecedented pandemic and its ensuing quarantine, one that will surely impact the way we live for a long time to come. The truth is, this gives us time to think about things like loneliness. It's hard to talk about this, though. When beginning to write this talk, I wanted to reach out to my 500-plus friends on social media to ask if they were lonely and to invite them to take the same survey I took to prove it. I couldn't do it, though. It's just not a topic we talk about. You know, I moved a lot as a teenager, and each time I had to work to make new friends and fit in, it became so difficult for me that I hated high school, and I ended up quitting altogether. Instead of reaching out for support or social outlets, I just gave up. I needed help, but I was too embarrassed to have this conversation, and that has to stop. Why don't we talk about it? 61%. That's a majority. That means if you don't feel lonely, someone you know does. This is obvious. It's a problem we all share. We don't talk about it because, like so much of the human experience, there's a stigma associated with loneliness. Stigma, as Dr. Pierre Lebol points out, is a process of being shamed and excluded from society. It's a process. So in that process, we can break the cycle. By talking more openly about loneliness, we normalize this common human emotion, and we stop the stigma. By redefining our own experience with loneliness, we begin to heal, and we take away its power to hurt us. Loneliness is defined in several ways, but as educator, researcher, and psychiatrist Dr. Chandra Savarda Tiwari points out, it is our perception of being alone and isolated that matters most. So, and hear me out. If we redefine loneliness as an opportunity for growth, we can consider this time spent as a place for peace, rest, self-reflection, and solitude. But we have to start this conversation. How do we do that, and what does it look like? Well, for me, it was a TED Talk. For you, it can be something much easier than this. So recently, without any provocation from me whatsoever, a friend of mine did something extraordinary. She posted a question on Facebook. She asked, what are some ways to deal with loneliness other than alcohol? And yes, she means healthy ways. We often deal with loneliness in unhealthy, self-destructive ways. The responses were pretty amazing. Many people shared their experience with alcohol and the negative impacts that ensued. Others offered a hand. Call your old friend. I'd love to catch up. Come, social distance visit me. I miss you. Others offered advice, like self-care, self-reflection, or just doing something new, fun, exciting, rewarding, trying a new recipe, or something as simple as going out and taking a walk in the sunshine, or cuddling your pets. Best of all, what this showed us is that others have been there and they care. And it also broke that cycle of isolation and silence that often accompanies loneliness. Another thing I learned through the course of writing this talk is that when I shared my idea with others, they opened up about their experience with loneliness. This allowed for a real connection, and that connection means so much. There is research that suggests there's a positive outcome to this pandemic. While our interest in meeting new people may be diminishing over time, our desire to help them is not. A Netherlands study, published as a part of a larger study on pro-social development in adolescents aged 10 to 20 years of age, identified that young people are becoming more inclined to give to strangers and those most in need. The study examined 147 participants before the quarantine, and then again after spending considerable time in social isolation, as they journaled their thoughts, including their mood, desire to help others, and their concern for the well-being of others. And then they played dictator games. This is a game that rewards participants for sharing resources. So the second report showed a higher level of giving to strangers, especially those impacted by COVID-19, healthcare workers, and those at greater risk, than to giving to friends, which was always the standard outcome. We are becoming more caring as a result of the pandemic. Now, while it's difficult to determine whether these young participants will act more altruistically or more inclined to do good deeds, they should. Another study published by the UC San Diego Centers for Healthy Aging determined that empathy and compassion could solve our loneliness problem. Participants were surveyed on characteristics often associated with wisdom, such as empathy, compassion, emotional regulation, self-reflection, alongside the UCLA loneliness scale. Those who rated high in wisdom categories often rated low in loneliness. This research predicts that we could affect these outcomes. We could make real change in the world of loneliness. Doing good makes us feel good. So doing good deeds helps us see the world through a positive lens as we overcome adversity and we build resilience. I believe that through intentional good deeds, even small good deeds, random acts of kindness, even social distance, volunteerism, and service to others, we become more familiar with ourselves. And we become our own companion, where we can truly find our solitude. We must take the time to acknowledge what it feels like to be alone as we gain wisdom and insight by reaching out to others and doing good deeds and service. Most importantly, and this is the most important thing of all, we have to realize that we are not alone in our loneliness and talk openly about it. This is the step that I have taken here today, that we've now taken together. I know that this conversation can be life-changing for someone. So reach out to one another and continue this conversation. Thank you.